Well, another aspect of President Obama's ambitious agenda is doubling foreign aid by the end of his first term. Well, there's a couple of questions about this. One, given the economic crisis, is that something that's either politically or practically possible? And the other is it even a good idea? Our next guest, who some call the Bono, says foreign aid to Africa needs to stop altogether. Joining us first on CNBC, Dambisa Moyo. She's the author of Dead Aid, Why Aid is Not Working and How There Is a Better Way for Africa. Also a former economist with Goldman Sachs and a former World Bank consultant. Dambisa, good to have you with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm sorry saying you're the Bond instead of the Bono. Steve was just talking, so I had it on the brain. But you have come out with a controversial idea, which is we've been providing government aid to Africa for a very long time, from the United States, Europe, other places, and you're saying maybe we should, within 5 years, not have any aid at all. What leads you to believe that would work?
The evidence is very clear. My whole argument is based on logic and evidence, and we have seen consistently across the world that countries that have not relied on aid have performed economically better in terms of alleviating poverty and generating economic growth. Countries like China and India, of course, but even closer to home, places like South Africa and Botswana have not relied on aid and actually have delivered what the original architects of aid have failed to do.
And you also say that democracy may not necessarily be required for economic growth. Now, you talk about India and China. One of them, obviously, is the world's biggest democracy, right, and the other is much more authoritarian. Right. What makes you think that democracy is not needed in Africa?
Well, just to clarify, my point is actually it's not a prerequisite for economic growth. I mean, clearly, we all want to live in a free and fair democratic society where we can hold governments accountable. In an aid model, the problem is that governments in Africa are not held accountable, and in a sense, because of the aid dependency, the domestic citizenry are not, they're disenfranchised. And so you cannot have a democratic society anyway. And so the focus on providing more funds towards democracy seems to me foolhardy.
One thing that seems, when you think about Africa, sort of links to Latin America, where you have a few people who have a lot of all of the resources and access to all the money, and then a lot of people who don't have that.
Right.
And in Africa, it also seems you have borders that were arbitrarily decided by colonial powers.
Right.
And there's still wars going on over where those borders are and what tribe can live where. Can we ever move to a continent that is wealthy if you can't figure out those borders?
Well, in the book, I talk about the fact that I do argue that a lot of the reasons we see civil unrest in Africa actually has its roots in aid, because there's this whole tendency to try and capture wealth, and unfortunately in the African context this by and large tends to be from aid. Beyond that, I would say the whole idea that it's colonialism or tribalism, I think are just red herrings and actually are not really getting to the roots of the issue. We know that economics matters. We know that people need jobs and they want jobs. Just as you mentioned on the U.S. economy, but it's also a figment of the emerging world. People want jobs, and aid model cannot and has not delivered jobs, and that's what the problem is.
If aid were to go away in 5 years, what would you do instead?
What we would do is basically the prescriptions that I offer in the second half of the book, which is what other countries have done very successfully. Focus on trade, not necessarily trade with the Western countries like the United States and Europe, but focus on trade with the emerging countries like China, like India, like Brazil, and so on. Also focusing on the bond markets. Again, yes, we're going through challenging times. It's not always going to be like this. Are African countries ready to come and access the capital markets when the market changes? It seems to me that they're not, and we need to emphasize to them that they need to focus on finding other sources of capital. All
right, well, Dambisa, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
And Dambisa's book, as we said again, Dead Aid, Why Aid is Not Working. There we have it on the screen. A very controversial argument, and certainly challenging the likes of Bono. So take a look and read that. And Neil Ferguson, regular guest of ours, wrote her